Yeah, welcome to ProDev. We have a ProDev series, which we do once a quarter, and we kind of try to pick a topic that we're really interested in, or we think other people are interested in, or we think just needs to be maybe explored a little more thoroughly. So it's a great way for us to push our own potential and to kind of keep creating content, but kind of to keep exploring new things. This quarter, we're going to do the complexities of roasting. So we're going to cover the basics, the intricacies, and the complexities. Not a roasting tutorial. So not really a how-to, but a like, oh wow, kind of ProDev, just to give you some context. We've split it up into 3 different stages or 3 different phases. Phase 1 is the charging or drying phase. During this phase, free moisture is being driven off of the coffee, and then thermal energy is beginning to be imparted to the coffee. So moisture that's trapped in that cellular structure of the coffee is rising in temperature, the pressure is building up, and all of that kind of leads up to initiating first crack. All of these things together can be described as thermal momentum. There's no significant chemical reactions occurring as of yet, but everything that kind of happens here lays the base and the framework and the foundation for the rest of the roast. Matching the time between dropping coffee into the roaster and beginning of yellowing between batches of the same coffee is critical in achieving consistency. So if your time is too short, your roast can proceed too quickly and may result in scorching. If your time is too long, there may not be enough pressure built up to carry the coffee into first crack. Once a desirable drying time has been established for a given roast curve, negative effects can be easily perceived towards the end of the roast, a little bit easier. So too much heat early on decreases drying time, which then decreases the time available later in the roast for proper development, and then that can result in off-spec flavors. Phase 2 is the Maillard reaction, the Maillard phase. The beginning of chemical reactions, namely the Maillard reaction, is represented by the yellowing of coffee and the presence of bread-like aromas instead of hay-like aromas. It technically continues until a coffee is dropped and sufficiently cooled, or there are no more compounds available to keep that reaction going. But we're going to kind of consider it a distinct and separate section from what happens after first crack. The Maillard reaction is one of the most chemically complex reactions that occurs during roasting, more than doubling the amount of aromatic compounds that are found in that coffee relative to its green state. It's a form of non-enzymatic browning, which typically proceeds rapidly from like 280 degrees to around 330 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's a chemical reaction between amino acids and reducing sugars that gives browned food its distinctive flavor. There are a vast array of compounds that are created during this phase, but the most notable are melanoidins. They primarily affect flavor, body, texture. They have a higher molecular weight, which leads to having a heavier perception of mouthfeel. So this reaction, along with caramelization, is responsible for the browning that occurs in the roasting process. They're 2 distinct processes, but to our naked eye, they're relatively the same. Phase 3 is development. Transition to this section of the roast is denoted by coffee entering first crack, which signifies the beginning of sugar caramelization. The caramelization is responsible for a buildup of water vapor and CO2 gas, which eventually leads to the physical fracturing of first crack. The Maillard reaction is still occurring, like we said, but it's now reacting with different compounds. The reactants are created by sucrose caramelization, organic acid degradation, and pyrolysis. You may wonder, hey Christina, oh sorry, how does roasting affect flavor? Great question. The flavor of coffee is most drastically manipulated from the time of first crack through the end of the roast, and this is what we refer to as development time. So both the Maillard reaction and sugar caramelization are happening during this section until the roast is dropped into the cooling tray. In general, shorter development times lead to less cooked flavors, you can say, so a lot more fruit, citrus, bright, crisper notes, and then the longer the development time, the more cooked the flavors will be. So leaning towards what you could perceive as heavier or darker flavors, a lot more chocolate notes, molasses, maybe even tobacco. So an example of this in real life could be the same coffee roasted 3 different ways. So if you had a Guatemalan coffee, its baseline, which would be like its ideal roast, could have some sweet nuts, perfumed florals, spice, molasses. A shorter development time would bring out more sweet citrus, white tea, lime notes, and then a longer development time would be more baked fruits, maybe like mulled spices, again, tobacco, vanilla, honeys, but things that are more perceived as heavier or darker. Let's taste some coffee.
Yeah, man.
It's influencing us in the start of 10. And the reason for that is that a lot of that crust comes from carbon dioxide.
Tea-ish, not really.
Yeah.
Like peanut, like shells. Are you sure?
12 is such a good coffee smell. What happens when you don't drink your coffee?
Yeah.
You start getting delirious. You're overtired.
No.
Doesn't taste that bad.
That's a good part. So yeah, 12 plus, so
That is excellent.
11.
11.
Sweet spot. 11.
So this is a very relative process, but this is like relative to our production roast lengths.
Because if you let it go 1 more minute, that is such a different taste than that minute before, right?
Nail down what you're doing for this part of the roast. Flavor differences are much more perceptible in the end of the roast. So all of this part matters, but where like the real flavor impact differences will be after you kind of set these as variables. So just like you've probably learned with Christina, there are 6 major variables that affect the brewing process. Similarly, there's major variables that affect roasting. And we're going to talk about 5 key factors and then a couple side factors. So 1, batch size. How much coffee you're putting into the roaster makes a big difference in how you're going to roast it. Just like if you're cooking a 1-pound roast versus a 2-pound roast. You got to know that, you have to think about it. If you are cooking more coffee at once, you're probably going to want to charge it into a slightly hotter environment. Just keep in mind how it carries momentum. You might, pull back your heat differently to compensate for it just being a bigger mass with more momentum. Factor 2 is density. So the coffee itself, how dense is it? Denser material has more efficient heat transfer from like molecule to molecule. So it's going to affect what you're doing. Coffee that's grown at a higher elevation typically is denser, and a lower elevation is less dense. Processing can also affect density. So you just kind of want to plan according to that. It's something that you can measure before you start roasting, or it's something that you can kind of dial in from where you start. Third factor would be airflow. So this kind of operates in 2 ways. There's airflow from how fast you're spinning the drum, so your RPM. Faster would be higher airflow, just kind of pulling more air through. And lower RPM would be slightly less airflow. Key to that is that if it's spinning too fast, you can have centrifugal force pushing beans against the outer wall and maybe getting scorched through that process. And if it's going too slow, the beans can kind of end up sitting there and burning that way. So you want to make sure that's operating correctly. The other factor for airflow is your fan speed, so how much air is being pushed through the coffee throughout the process. If you're adjusting that midway through, or whether you keep it as like a variable constant throughout. More airflow can kind of yield like potentially different flavors, like potentially crisper acidity or drier. So something to think about. Fourth major factor is heat distribution. So how hot is the roaster at any given point? How fast is the coffee going? Like how much momentum is it carrying? So with this, we talk about rate of rise. How many degrees per minute is it moving forward? And that relates closely to time distribution, but it isn't the same thing. And you can have something that takes it gets to a certain temperature, but how does it get to that temperature? And that's kind of important at every stage. So how hot do you charge it when you first put it into the roaster? How hot is the environment? How hot is it while it's drying? How hot is it during yellowing? And then how hot is it and how fast is it moving during the development phase? And kind of interlocking with that is time distribution. So these things are very closely related, but they're not exactly the same. You could time out all the phases to take the same amount of time and potentially be distributing the heat and time slightly differently. So just how long are you drying the coffee for? You know, how long is it yellowing for? How long is it developing for? What's the total cook time? So then these are the essential elements, but a couple other things you'd want to think about before you start roasting a particular coffee or during the roasting process are moisture. So we've talked a lot about how the first part is drying that moisture out and how crack is kind of propelled by what moisture is left, kind of getting to a boiling point and exploding. So how much moisture is there to begin with is something you're going to have to think about, because it's going to affect the way things happen throughout. How long the coffee needs to dry. If the coffee is drier, it might be more likely to get scorched. If it has more moisture, it might be more likely to lose momentum after it explodes from, you know, its moisture heating up. So it's definitely an important factor too. And then the last thing you'd always want to think about is just experience and resources. So me roasting the coffee. How well do I know the coffee? How well do I know the machine? What's the environment like around here? And that's like really always going to matter. So these are the key variables, but those also really affect kind of what's going on. And then the other thing, which Christina will talk about, is what's it being roasted on? What's the machine like? She'll kind of take us through that.
Awesome. So we talked about the science behind roasting. We talked about some essential elements. We compare these also to give a little side note to like the brewing essential elements that we spoke about, and how there are always things that you can manipulate and control. One of the obvious variables that I think people think about when it comes to roasting is the equipment that you're using. This is one other variable, but it's a huge variable. Before we start talking about roasters, we can talk about the kind of heat transfer that they all allow. So before we talk roasters, we have three kind of main transfers of heat: conduction, convection, and then radiation. Conduction is going to be the transfer of heat through physical touch. Convection is going to be the flow of heat through some sort of bulk movement of a medium. And then radiation is kind of also that transfer of heat without the need for a medium. So if you're thinking of the difference mainly between conduction and convection, which is what we'll talk about with roasting, it's the difference between the transfer of heat from touch versus the flow of heat from one thing to another. These are all the roasters that we use at Counterculture. So we're going to talk mainly about drum roasters, and then we're also going to talk about the Loring, because that's what we roast on. Drum roasters are the most widely used form. Generally, they're more economical. It's a pretty relatively simple design, as in it's a rotating cylindrical drum that applies heat either directly under the drum or through the center through a conduit or a channel. The actual heat can come from electric heating elements or a little gas flame underneath it. The heat is transferred through conduction and convection, and temperature measurements are usually taken in two places. One measures the flame temperature, and then there's another probe that's going to measure your ambient bean temperature inside of that roaster. They work great. There's a lot of variability with drum roasters. The amount of heat, your rotating speed of the drum are both factors that you as a roaster can adjust and check. They offer a little bit more customization and variability that allow you to tailor to different green coffees. The Loring is a completely different kind of roaster. In the smallest of nutshells, hot air flows through a chamber, delivering a homogeneous distribution of heat. In a slightly larger nutshell, heat is pulled off of the burner by a fan. It's forced into the inlet of the drum, forced through a bed of beans. Then it's pulled out by a return fan. That air goes back into the burner, and then it's kind of a rinse and repeat, and it's a contained system. The drum itself is stationary, and instead there are paddles inside that churn the beans around. This uses mostly convection. It assures much more uniformity with your roast. Since it's not touching anything, it's kind of being heated the same way throughout, because there's no touch to touch, and it's just being kind of surrounded by the heat instead. Also, the hot air that passes through that chamber immediately sweeps away any chaff that's going to come off the beans into a separate chamber, unlike in a drum roaster where they kind of tumble along with the beans as they go. So the loring is a little bit more consistent, it's lower emissions, and it's a lower gas bill at the end of the day. But the two kind of main ones that we talk about, so drum roasters and then the loring, which is kind of all into itself, just a different roaster. Cool. We're going to have our next activity break, which is going to be, we're going to taste one coffee 4 different ways. So one thing to kind of take note of, so we talked about different roasters, we talked about why they're different and how they transfer heat differently and how that affects things. But one thing we didn't really mention was, again, all of those variables coming into play, and how long something takes and how quickly something can happen. So what we tasted in the beginning was like, oh, this like natural progression, and then immediately coffee, and then development happens really, really fast. These are within a pretty small range of time, and we'll see if we can taste a ton of differences with them.
Yeah, just jump in. Feel free to break more than one. Once they've been broken, they're broken, but yep. And just until they're all done, because what you're doing is stopping the brewing process, and we want to do that very uniformly. So try to hit them all ASAP. So one thing that we're asked sometimes is like, how do you know when you've roasted the coffee correctly? And we have kind of like a few-fold process going on into evaluating that. One thing we do is look at how the roast ran. So did we like how long it took, how the heat was distributed throughout? Did it happen like we wanted? The second process is a light reflecting technology, which on our coast is called the color track. So that shines light on the bed of ground coffee and gives us a number that correlates with how dark or light it is. And then on the East Coast, they have a technology called the Agtron that does a very similar thing. So that's giving you kind of some numbers to work off. Then the third kind of way that we assess quality and whether we have done our job correctly is what we're about to do, which is tasting. So a number should never dictate your entire process, but your process should dictate essentially a number that you can then use to like fact check yourself. So something that we get asked a lot about in West is how do we decide what goes on each roaster? We don't slot coffee onto roasters based on how we want it to taste. We hone our roasting process to like, so you roast something differently on each respective machine to get it to taste the same. And that's, so we kind of like reverse engineer that. You can't do the same thing on every roaster and make it taste the same, but you can get the same exact flavor profile off any roaster while tweaking your process. And one of the fun things about counterculture is that we have a pretty apprenticeship-based kind of homegrown sort of roasting program. So there's no top-down legislation of how everybody does what. So when you taste a coffee and you buy 2 bags of counterculture coffee on 2 different dates, they could have been roasted by 2 people on 2 different machines using 2 different methodologies for how they approach the roasting and have them taste exactly the same. And that's something that takes a lot of work. Yeah, that's a pride point.
This number represents what it is on the light and dark scale?
That's right.
Okay, and then this one is just the time.
That's the time it took to roast. So you'll see that it doesn't necessarily take a shorter amount of time to roast a coffee lighter. Sometimes to get a coffee lighter and have it still taste good, you might even want to roast it longer. Sometimes to keep, to have a coffee stay interesting when you're taking it dark, you might want to roast it faster. So how long you roast a coffee for is not the same thing as what roast level you roast it to.
So you would crank up the temperature or the heat like really to like blast it really fast?
Potentially, like with 46, I would say that's a coffee that we roast faster to maintain more nuance. Whereas roasting something really light, but you still want it to be developed and you still want it to be any coffee, any brew, that you could throw it in an espresso hopper and it would still extract correctly, you might want to roast it a little slower. So those are just kind of independent, but again, like codependent variables to think about and play around with if you really want to get your coffee to the perfect production roast level for all of your customers.
Complex, right?
Yes.
Is that the word you're looking for?
Yeah, complicated. I'm sorry. Not. I don't mean to use that word, but it was like.
You should use that
It's
word.
okay.
Yeah,
That's an okay word for it.
Yeah.
It's kind of a nice spread too, because we get asked counterculture, like, how do you know you roasted a coffee perfectly, or how do you know you roasted it well, and like, what are you looking for? And what's your philosophy on roasting? And even in this spectrum where it's pretty narrow and there's not crazy differences, everything is acceptable, everything was there was something to like in every cup, but we all were like, oh, but that's where the coffee shined the most, and we got a lot of sweetness, we got a lot of interesting flavors that we were like, oh, it seemed the best. And that's kind of what we try, because you can roast a coffee and get it to that like dark developedness, and then it loses a little bit of what was exactly what you said, James, like shining about it. And it's kind of the complexity of the entire process is finding this little spectrum of like perfection for what that coffee can be. Cool. We got one more section and then we're wrapping up.
So there's more to life than roasting. We've talked all about roasting, but the fact is, like, quality ingredients make a quality coffee. So you can't roast quality into coffee, just like you can't, brew a great coffee out of something that was poorly roasted. We can't roast a great coffee out of something that wasn't well sourced. So like, as you know, coffee is a plant. Relationships with farmers who grow coffee is a super important part of our model, and that's something that can very much complicate or simplify the roasting process. So we have a long-term focus on sustainable partnerships and helping our producing partners reach their full potential, and then in turn we make that commitment and we're able to roast same coffees year after year and really get to know them. Like, I have coffees that I've been roasting 3 years in a row, tasting 6 years in a row, similar to how we want to develop partnerships with our brewing partners. So, a huge part of that is just, making those commitments and working to help everyone increase quality, because then we're able to roast high quality coffee. It's definitely easier to roast great coffee than bad coffee or, mediocre coffee. And it actually makes people's lives better as well. So that is a huge part of how to roast great coffee is buy great coffee. A huge part of how to buy great coffee is invest in great coffee. So, we have a lot of great producing partners that we could go on and on about. But just for like the sake of this, I'll talk about the Gallardos, Jose and Eileen. They kind of sent a little bag of coffee to Durham, and we always will sample roast any coffee that comes through the door and send feedback. So their coffee wasn't great, but the coffee department saw a lot of potential there, and they worked with that family, and that is a geisha that's gone on to win the United States Barista Champion for the last 2 years running. And is probably the most expensive coffee on our menu, and it's really unbelievable to taste. It's like, that's the coffee I showed my mom to have her realize that coffee's amazing and, more than just her Folgers. So that's like that's a huge part of how to roast, is to kind of put thought as far back into the chain as possible. And then also making sure that you're, partnering on this side of the chain, teaching people how to brew and kind of considering the surrounding factors, because I can roast great coffee, but if you folks can't brew it well, that's kind of where that quality ends. So that's something you always have to think about. This is our roasting team. This is ProDev. Any questions about the roasting process?
What are like the qualifications you kind of look for in someone to make them become a roaster?
I think that if it were me doing hiring, it'd be an open mind and a good work ethic, because sometimes roasting can be glamorized in a way that, leads people to think that they're going to be standing there smelling. It's like that meme, like what my friends think I do, like what I actually do.
Oh, yeah.
So you want to just be familiar with the realities. Like, you're going to be handling a lot of green coffee, which is dusty, and a lot of burlap. You're going to get all dirty. Like, I wouldn't wear this while roasting. So, you kind of want to have like your work clothes and just be ready to haul a lot of weight, because that's a huge part of what you do. And then, just somebody with an open mind and who is excited to learn, as always, as in any job.
Yeah, I know it's very, very complicated, but like, what are the most common mistakes that a beginner roaster does in the beginning when they're learning?
That's a good question. It really depends on the coffee program, what is considered a mistake and how easy it is to make a mistake. At Counterculture, we have a strong culture of apprenticeship and trial and error. So we don't want roasters to be trained up on a heavily rigid procedure. We want them to learn and develop good sensory skills and a good intuition built out of doing the same thing over and over again and developing gut instincts. So as part of that, we kind of have a certain amount of breakage, like I hit the coffee at the wrong roast level. We have pretty intensive quality specs. So, a lot of the mistake you would make is just like misproportioning the heat. So putting it in too hot or too cold, and then the roast either runs away on you or it really goes slowly. And then just even choosing the wrong moment to let the coffee stop cooking. You know, as you saw, it goes fast at the end there. So just, you know, letting it go a little bit too long and having it just kind of lose some of that, you know, what makes it special. Or letting it go too soon and having it not really fully be able to express yet what makes it special. There's really any number of mistakes you could make. And at Counterculture, we do encourage a learning process that lets people make those mistakes, but minimizes the risk in terms of, you know, how much product is being lost, because that is people's hard work on the production side. And we don't just want to waste coffee, but we do want people to develop into autonomous kind of roasting thinkers that can handle new situations and roast new coffees without somebody needing to, you know, give them a roast line to follow and give them really specific directions.
How do you guys keep it like so consistent? Because I know there's a variable between different roasters when you have to make sure you set the right temperature, but everyone's mindset is really different, even though you train them, right? So how do you keep it consistent when you guys tab switch in between different roasters? Like, I feel like that's like almost impossible, right? Because everyone's mind is working differently. Like, oh, I think this coffee is this, has this much density, so I think I'm gonna put it higher, you know, the temperature.
Absolutely.
How do you know, justify that to make it more consistent?
It's a good question. Really, it's a lot of, you know, constant communication, saying like this worked, tasting together, working as a team is really important. And then there's a certain amount of tolerance from what a person can taste the difference in. So we tasted things that have slightly dramatic differences to make sure that they were noticeable. But if you think about the space from minute 1 to the next minute, but that's not necessarily like the variance you'd be thinking of. Think about like maybe 3 seconds, 5 seconds. It can be within a range that you don't necessarily notice that something is different, and it might not even taste different or be different on the color track. So just a lot of communication, guidance. One thing that's really important for it is retention. So our roasting teams have very low turnover, and we're able to actually cultivate experienced team members that are there long term and roast the same coffees year after year.
You know, for your blends,
Mm-hmm.
do you get the green beans and then mix it up together and then blend all at once? Or you roast them first and then combine them at the end?
That's a good question, and it depends on what we're trying to achieve. So for hologram, we keep those components separate and then blend them once they're roasted, because they're of pretty different densities, and we want to roast them to a slightly different roast level. And at their roast level, we want to make sure that they're pretty close to each other so that the extraction is really even. But with something like 46, as I was saying earlier, we want to maintain more dynamic flavors. So we blend them green and let that different density and different character kind of create more dynamism in the end cup, because we know they're all going to get roasted completely since we're taking it to second crack.
I would think like that blends, they're just so much more complex than single origins.
Mm-hmm.
And it just fascinates me that, you know, they just sell at a retail level cheaper than single origins. And I know it's a seasonal thing because single origins, there's seasonality
Mm-hmm.
parts of it, but I think just blends itself, you're doing like multiple different green beans and you can mix them and make sure that they're consistent. To me, I think it's just like amazing how complex it is, but like people value it as a less price. I think it's so much more complicated on doing blends.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It takes a lot of thought from our coffee department as to how to take coffees that are priced correctly for blends and maximize quality, but also make sure that the coffees going into blends are specifically the ones that can exhibit their best character, potentially at a slightly darker roast level. Mm-hmm. Coffees that do have all that sweetness in there that will come out best when they're roasted a little longer. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely like sometimes an expectation that blends will cost less, so you want to think about that with pricing. Coffee that costs less isn't necessarily less good, but definitely when you're constructing a menu, and this is something that Katie works really hard on with the rest of the coffee department.
I would say on the production side, the single origin coffees do generally take more work.
Yeah.
Like it's more lab work to filter those through, and it's definitely more work on the farm level when we're thinking about what we're contracting and when those producers are making those coffees for us. So I think that is the mindset for us that translates to the price discrepancy, but you're absolutely right that here we definitely spend more energy and time on roasting the blends, blending them, QCing them sometimes, like making sure that we're using the right recipe in the right amount. And the single origins just become like a little bit easier because it's just all about like, well, these are great coffees, let's just make sure that they're expressing their greatness. But on the origin side, they take more work.
We work very hard to keep very consistent flavor profiles throughout the year. We don't want you to notice a change just because components change. Like, we're very transparent about what components are going into the coffee, but we also want to make sure that that's not a bumpy road, that it's a smooth one, because those coffees should offer that level of consistency.
As far as buying green beans for blends, are they cheaper than single origins?
They are, but they're most often from the same partners that we buy single origin coffees from. So it's just like a different cup score target, a little bit lower than single origin, and usually it can, if it's coming from a cooperative, for example, it's usually representative of more farmers' coffees, like a bigger amount of coffees blended together than the single origin coffees, which might be like a single farm selection or a single day's harvest, where there was a lot of energy put into achieving a higher cup score. So yeah, so when we're buying coffees from our partners though, we always contract different qualities for different prices. We never want to be we don't want to be buying coffee at market prices because it's not a sustainable price for farmers, even though maybe we could like get 46 from coffee that we're just buying from an importer's warehouse. And we also don't just want to be coming to a farmer cooperative and only buying the really high quality stuff and then leaving them with the rest of the stuff to sell, to find a buyer for. Like, we want to be like a bigger partner in the whole mix.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for coming.
And thank you for roasting some good coffee for us.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for brewing great coffee.
Bring back the antenna.
Will do.
Our